Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thank you for stopping by again. I'm doing this a little later in the afternoon, so maybe a little darker in here. I don't know, but I'll do my best. I was putting together a list of two, three, four little questions that people have asked that don't require a video, an entire video to answer each one. So I was going to collect them. And then in came a question from a subscriber this morning. And I thought, well, I'll give a shot at that one because it does deserve its own video. It's one of the tougher ones to answer to people's satisfaction. Okay. And this is obviously, it was an American subscriber who asked me to compare Panama's culture with America's culture. Whoa, it's a difficult topic because there is no American culture or Panamanian culture per se. Uh, we're a mixture of cultures. Both nations are nations of immigrants, as is Canada and a number of other nations. And within each nation, you'll find many different subcultural groups, so to speak. And when I go across the street here to pick up something that I need, a Coke or something of that sort, it's a chino. And that's reference to the fact that it's owned, as many of them are here, by Chinese Panamanians whose families came over to build the railroad, to build the canal, what have you, have been living here for generations. And they their own subcultural group. They're Chinese Panamanians, and they are a little bit different than others. We have a big Greek Panamanian community here in town. They're shippers. They've been running through the canal for a long, long time. We have an Italian, very large Italian community. We have an Indian community from India. This is a trade country. It's just collected as people from many different parts of the world. And as a result, you don't have one Panamanian culture. And then in addition to that, you have the expats who live here, and so many of them are here on business. And so they live here in town, and they're from all over. But you may think they're from Panama because they speak Spanish, and they sort of look like the Latinos, and they are, but they're not from Panama. And they will have cultural differences. There are very distinct differences among Latin American nations and how they respond to things. Somebody from Chile is not from Mexico, and you'll learn that very quickly if you know the two countries and speak to their people. They have different ways. There was an interesting story a while back I was reading where a couple were getting married, and she had a Cuban background. He had an Ecuadorian background, and their parents, their mothers, got into a terrible conflict over how the wedding was to be held because the two countries have very, very different traditions for their weddings. And the couple went off and just got married legally and were done with it because it just got to be too much. It was meant in an amusing way, and it was amusing because the differences are rather dramatic in some instances. So you have multiple cultures. And in Panama, yes, in the city, it's one thing. In the countryside, it can be something quite different. And it depends on where in the countryside that you're talking. And it's, it's easy to generalize about Panamanian culture when you're just talking about your own experience with a few people here, a few people there, with a 1/1000th of 1% of the population. But if you really try to look at it on a broader scale and you get out of the 20th century, we're in the 21st, and there's been a terrific change in the mixture of people who live here and work here every day, then it gets a lot more complicated. The same thing in the US. And I come from a small village of less than 1,000 people in upstate New York. And I can tell you, we're very different than people in New York City. And even today, we're still quite different. I have no doubt, and still have friends who live there. Uh, you travel around the United States, you can run into different regional cultures. It's not as obvious as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. When I traveled around the United States, the differences among regions were pretty dramatic sometimes. But today, it's less so, but they're still real. So you really have to take that into account. The and I think the best way to look at it is this: much of the cultural difficulties we have them here will boil down to certain differences, and one of those is Spanish. Right off the bat, one reason why it's a little easier for you to adjust to somebody else's approach to things in, say, in the U.S. or in Canada or Britain or Australia, if you're English speaking, is because they speak English, and it may be a different kind of English than the one you speak at home, especially if you're in another country, but it's English, and that makes it so much easier. And when you're dealing with another language, and it doesn't make any difference where you go, if it's another language than English, and people there are speaking it as a second language, not as their first language, and you are not speaking their language as a first language, but as a second language, it can lead to more misunderstanding, and above all, you get uncomfortable and you get nervous. This is the one thing that's so clear amongst expats who come down. There are some who, wise people, they just relax, they smile. That's so critical here. I'd say one thing about it, smiling is good. And when they're trying to communicate with somebody and they only have a limited Spanish, and the Panamanian often is just like them. They're embarrassed too because they don't think their English is very good, and so on. So when you relax and do your best, they relax and do their best. And I've had very few difficulties, especially in the beginning when I spoke about 6 words of Spanish and kept having to fall back in other languages, kind of come up with a word that would work. Yeah, I got on just fine. So that's one thing that can, if it makes you nervous and you get upset, as I'll tell you, a few years ago, sitting around with a group of Panamanian friends, and one of them was a clerk in a store here, and she said, Bob, what's the problem with gringos? Gringo's not a bad term here. It's perfectly okay. And this was around like 2009 or so, when the Americans had just shot themselves in the foot and ruined their housing market was collapsing around them and everything was a disaster. And I said, you have to understand these people are going through a very stressful period and they're coming down now and they're having trouble selling their homes, or they didn't get as much money for their house as they thought they were going to get last year. And it just affects everything that they see and do. And so be considerate of that. It's just a very tense time for a lot of Americans who are coming down here. So I'm sorry. See, her words were bitter and sour. And what she was talking about was not what they were saying. It was the looks on their faces. It was that stress, that strain. If they could have seen themselves in the video, they would have immediately understood what the problem was. But you can't see yourself. You can't see your face. And that's too bad, because you won't know. There are times that that's the case. And smiling helps, because it breaks that, it takes that out of the picture. So I'm not going to say more, because I have more on the Spanish language in another video, and we'll leave it at that. A second one here, well, I just mentioned it in part. It's frustration. And that is the frustration of trying to learn and get into the flow of things the first year or two particularly. You're always learning, and you think it's painful and it's difficult. Well, yeah, to some extent, it always is. Again, it doesn't make any difference where you go. It's not like you can go to Uruguay or someplace and it's not going to happen. It's going to happen there. It's going to happen in Thailand. It's just natural when you move from one society to another. If you go to one that speaks your own language, you can run into that problem too. It's the frustration of having to learn how to do things when what you typically have always done all your life isn't quite right or is plain out wrong. So it puts that pressure on you to adapt and to make some changes. And if you can do that, then you're probably going to be just fine. But at first, it takes time to learn how to make new habits and how to deal with it. And some people find that easier to do than others. But the people who tend to work things out, and the great majority who stay here, they've found ways to deal with that frustration and not necessarily assume to everybody in the country or the entire nation's that way. As I've said in other videos, I was an American. I went all over the world for 50 years. This is my 50th anniversary this year. And countries all over. And as an American, oh boy, from the Vietnam War all the way on through, I mean, I constantly was hearing America being criticized for all sorts of things and people making all sorts of judgments about American culture, and they were wrong. And they had an experience. They went there and it was a bad one, or they saw something on television, or one thing or another, and it generalized that out to the entire population. And that was wrong, pure and simple. So I had to work my way through that without getting angry or upset. That never does any good. And yet other people, this is 40, 50 years ago before an internet, who thought America was the land of milk and honey. The streets were paved in gold. Everything was perfect there. And it definitely was not true. And you're trying to help them get a balanced view of your own nation. And you're finding it's too much one way or too much the other way. So this happens, and it happened to me a lot. And it still can happen sometimes even today, internet or no internet, but people have their attitudes about who an American is and what American culture is like. And I know perfectly well that my home birth nation's culture is made up of many, many cultures. Likewise here in Panama. There, another item that people don't think of too often, and it's amusing to me because, especially from my generation, is age. Now, the average age of people in the world as a whole, from censuses taken everywhere, is about 30. In Panama, it happens to be 28. So we're right around that range. In the United States, it's around 38. They're 10 years older on average. Average American is 10 years older than the average Panamanian. And they're, as far as Europeans are concerned, they tend to be 12 to 15 years older than the average Panamanian. This comes from the big baby boom that we all heard about in the US, where they had one in Canada. They've had it in Europe. They've had it in a number of nations. These are typically nations that lost a lot of people in World War II and rebuilt their populations following that. China is even worse off, not only because of World War II, but because of their one-child per family policy that they kept for so long. So you've got aging countries. These are much older countries. And they may even have difficulty understanding their own culture now because they're not young anymore. In 1970, I was 25 years old. The average age of an American in 1970 was 28, same as it is here in Panama. And that was great. I had a wonderful time, but there were a number of people in their 40s and 50s and older who really thought we were just crazy. They didn't understand our lifestyle. They didn't understand how we wore clothes. They didn't understand our hair. They didn't understand a lot of things, a lot of our attitudes, our willingness to express ourselves very openly and publicly. They were quite dissatisfied with it. They're dead today. Sad to say, may they rest in peace. They were good people, but they had a lot of difficulty adjusting to having so many young people. We were the baby boom, and there were just tons of people in their 20s that were right on through the 70s, and it just made it challenging for that older generation to have to adjust, and they did. But it took time. It was not painless, but they accomplished it. And it's sort of ironic as a result that now this baby boom arrives as older people here in Panama. And now they're dealing again with a younger population, substantially younger. They're going to have their parties. They're going to last all night long until 6:30 in the morning. Count on it, because that's the way it is, and they have great fun and they love partying. And it's just a different atmosphere, because in this society they do not have a baby boom. So the older population is a smaller portion of the population. The young are the larger portion. So you have an age differential operating here too. And I look at people in their 60s and 50s and 60s in the U.S. and I say, come on, guys. You were the ones who were criticized in your day. Be careful that you're not reacting to people who are actually substantially younger than you are and have a different approach on life. So you have all these things that are operating, and it really boils down to one basic thing. It's not the cultures or the multiple cultures or whatever. It's not really the question. It's you. And it's your willingness to live and learn, I should say, to take that first year or two and just learn and adjust and adapt at bits and pieces. And you don't have to change everything, but learning that some things, if you take a different approach, it works better and so forth. And it will. I think the group that has the most difficult time with the so-called cultural question are those who come down with a vision of what Panama is in their mind, usually based on some sort of 20th century version of it that has no relationship to today's Panama. They come in and they expect it, they want it, they insist that it be a particular way, and they're sort of control oriented. They want to control their environment. There are some, it's a small group, but there's some who come down and act like we're little brown people down here and we're not very smart, we're not very educated, we're not very sophisticated, so they're superior because they come from the United States or from Canada or from Europe. I mean, it's not just Americans, guys. Not at all. Other Latin American countries can be even more this way that have long histories of being superior nations. And now they're coming to little tiny Panama, which is doing much better than their country is. You get the same sort of thing. Uh, those folks have the most trouble because they want Panama to be a certain way. And if it's not that way, they're not going to be happy. That's my advice to people like that who really are firmly into that camp is don't come. In fact, stay home. Be very, very careful where you choose where you go because you're going to run into this wherever you go. The world has changed. As I often mention to people, the average Panamanian has spent 60% of his or her life in the 21st century, and probably 80% of their memories are 21st century, quite unlike people like myself and perhaps you. And it's not just a question of people older, middle-aged people too. So across the board, the differences in culture are there, but it depends on what your neighbors are, the neighborhood you live in, the people you happen to run into. And you have to adapt and work with anybody you meet, and that includes wherever you live when you move to the other end of your country or to a different portion of your own nation. You just have to do it. And you can gripe and complain about it. That's human, that's normal. But if you really want to succeed, then you have to learn how to go with the flow, so to speak, and find things that you can adjust to that are worth it. And other things you don't like, you don't want to adjust to, you go on and you don't do them anymore. I mean, that sort of thing. You will work your way through it. So don't think in terms of cultures. Think in terms of adaptation. Think in terms of it's an adventure, and I'm going to learn, and I'm going to grow, and I'm going to pick up a whole pile of things, and some of them I'm not going to like, so I'm going to drop them by the side, but the others I'm going to really enjoy, and like the majority of folks here, you'll have a good time. I truly believe that, but some don't. So look into your own heart and your own soul, and ask yourself, am I ready to open up, to smile, and to learn? And if you are, hey, wherever you go with good joy and a truly hope you are successful. And if not, then reconsider whether you really want to move anywhere else than where you are right now. But thank you very much for asking that question. I wish I could give you one of these simple little answers saying, oh, this is what Panamanians do and this is what Americans do. And oh. You can find that out on the web. If you want to need it, you can find it. But the truth is different. It's a different world, and it's a good one.